them, the common points are often true. and you know, if you do scholarship, Martin Gilbert, the Churchill biographer, who was a teacher of mine, used to say, he wouldn't let, if you use the word perhaps, he would circle it and put perhaps not. and he would say, in the study of 19th and 20th century history, there isn't really any room for the word perhaps. You can look it up. And you know, there's a guy in the press lately, I can't remember his name, and it's probably good that I can't. He's a galvanizing politician in the state of India. And he's been going around giving speeches about how Winston Churchill is like Hitler. And he is. They were both human beings. Although Hitler almost fell below the standard of being called that. But one of the things Winston Churchill did was starve 3 million people in the Indian state of Bengal in the middle of the Second World War, he says. And that's a common charge. But you know, you can go look that up. We're publishing the document volumes, the official biography of Churchill, and there's just a lot in there about that, because they are starving there. And you know, it turns out they got much of their grain from the Rice Bowl, Thailand, Vietnam, and the Japanese had conquered that. My wife's daddy was a camp commander of a Japanese POW camp for 3 years that he was taken during the course of that conquest. So just go look that up, right? That's a really important fact, because why didn't they have anything to eat? Well, the answer is the enemy had the food and wouldn't give it to them. And you know, Churchill might have been in fault in this way or that, although he made serious efforts to get more grain to India in the middle of a war where transport was scarce. And on the other hand, you know, it's like, did Churchill do enough to save the Jews? Well, you got to start with the fact that Hitler killed them. And you know, Churchill killed Hitler. So, good move, Churchill. Anyway, I admired that talk very much. And you know, in this day and age, one of the most important things we can do in such a divided time is we can become critical thinkers. We should, when you read the news, you should read it. I confess, I don't watch the news. I made a note to myself to do a Google alert for Cheryl Atkinson, because there'll be lots of writing about what she says on TV, and I'm extremely unlikely to watch the CBS Evening News. But I'll get to see what she says, and that'll be happy for me. And you can do that too, and everybody you respect. And then if there's somebody you really don't respect, read them too, because it'll make you mad and give your day more liveliness. So I have to talk about, so we're in the academic world, right? And so my topic assigned to me is conservatism and American greatness in a conference on what is American greatness. What is? That's a Socrates question. TSD is the Greek. What is a thing? He wants to know what it is fundamentally, what it is in its essence. And in the academic world, it's always better to begin fundamentally. Fundamental is a fundamental word. It's cognate with the word foundation. It means the things at the base. So, I don't know, some of you were at the first timers breakfast, and it was absolutely delightful because the idea was inspired in me of asking Bridget to come up there, and she said, give a good talk. I'm on the way in. She's a student in my class right now in the college. A junior? She's a junior. And I said, no, you give it. And so she did. And you know, she was awesome, right? But then I tortured her best I could, and a young man that I also called up, and I asked him what things mean. And that's hard, right? What is the good? That's the fundamental question. The TSD question that Socrates asked the most is TSD agathos. What is the good? It's hard to say what that is, but important to say. So I've got 3 words, and it'll get a little complicated defining them. So I'm going to talk about a movie. That'll help. The 3 words are greatness, America, and conservatism. What do those words mean? So, greatness. I'll start with that, and I'll start with that in part because this morning a man who just asked a question, where is that guy, wanted to know the relationship between good and great. Oh, there you go, because a famous book by Jim Collins, it's an excellent book called Good to Great. We read it around the college. It's one of those splendid pieces of common sense. And it's a big rage in the business world, which is a sign of health in the republic. And so he developed a doubt because of our talking about the good, whether there's any difference between the good and the great. So, first of all, what is good? You know, you have to be able to say, and we talked about that a lot, so I'll just repeat it quickly this morning, and if you're not here for the first time, you won't understand. But, so, what is a horse? How do you tell the difference between a horse and a Great Dane? Right? A pony and a Great Dane, right? How do you know? And look at us. We're all people. And yet we all look different. And so, how do you know that we are what we seem to be? What is it about us that we notice, right? I never have. In a room like this, so many things are exactly like other things that it's hard to do. So the people are the best thing, right? You got woman and woman, right? And if Patricia Anino was the woman, this lady next to her, whose name I don't know, would not be a woman. So there's something in common that they have that makes them that. That's why we can use common noun, which is exactly the essence of human rationality. It's what we do. It's why we can talk. Thinking and talking are the same thing, and we think and talk in common nouns fundamentally. Proper nouns only make sense because they are instances of a common noun. And so that's a bottle, and if you cut the bottom, and it's a good one, it works, right? Look, it's upside down, it's not leaking. I can get the top off reasonably easy. It'll be good to drink from because it's narrow up here at the top and I won't slubber all over myself, right? If you cut the bottom off, it won't be any good anymore. You could carry it like this, but every time you sat it down, it'd fall over. Not such a good one. But if you take the top off, then what it would be really good for would be a funnel. As it loses the good of the bottle, it either becomes nothing or it gains the being and good of something else. And so the philosopher says, the good and being are convertible terms. And if you want to think about this, which is I've thought about, as you might be able to tell, for many years now, I just enjoy that question to death. And I make the students suffer. But just think about that. When you want to know what good is, and you want to know what being is, remember that they're synonyms. And construct a sentence and put one in and then put the other in, and you'll see that it works, right? That's good. What's great? Great comes from an old word that means bigger, thicker, coarser, larger, right? And it forever meant that. But if you look in etymological dictionaries, I don't know if you do that or not, but there's one that's free called the Online Etymological Dictionary. And I read a story about the guy who does it. He's a cranky old guy, and he's just given his life to this, and it's a great service. Because what it is the history of words. What words do they come from? And how do they develop? The great source for that is, of course, the Oxford English Dictionary, which you can also look up on the internet. I think you have to pay, but I'm not sure. The Online Etymological Dictionary tends to be the first result. If you just put in etymology good, that's what will come up as the first result on Google. I do it all the time. Well, great, and it also tells you how the word, it's a Dutch, German, Northern Europe word, right? It's not a romantic word, it's not from Latin or Greek, it's from Northern Europe. But then this Online Etymological Dictionary tells us that in 1848, the first use that can be found of it to mean excellent. Not just large, excellent. More of the good elevated, the good intensified. There's a phenomenon in classical philosophy that there's a word that's sort of above the word good. And kalon or kalos is the word, and it translates, one good way to translate it is beautiful. Noble is also a good way to translate it. And the beautiful or the noble, that's not just good, that's better, best even, see? And so greatness of America would be if America was a good kind of thing, and if it was excellent, or the most excellent at being that kind of thing. So that's what those words mean, I think. And that sets you out thinking, no, because to know, I just said the good of a thing, you have to know the being of a thing, and that means you can't talk about American greatness till you identify what America is. And come to find out in this controversial time, the source of the deep controversies is a difference about what America is. And there are two stories to tell. I'll try to tell them as stories because they'll be easier to understand. How many people have seen the movie 2001? A lot? I'll tell you a little bit about it, but I urge you to go watch it because although it's, what is it like? It's weighty and vague and compelling, you know. But there's a story in it. And it actually is the view of the world from the point of view of modern liberalism. At the beginning of the story, there's some apes, and they're grunting and fighting with the ape tribe next door, and fighting with a panther who eats one of them. And it's a lot of grunting and a lot of, you know, it's kind of savage, stark looking. And then they get up one morning and there's this monolith. And you know, there isn't anything in nature that's got perfect animal angles and smooth sides, and this monolith is perfectly shaped and simply undistinguishable. It's black and a perfectly smooth surface. It just doesn't look like it goes there at all. It has to be artificial, that is to say, made by some purpose, not natural, because nature doesn't, at least in our world, produce things like that. And this thing shrieks at them, this monolith. And the next thing you know, one of the apes picks up a stick and hits the panther with it. Now, the ape can pick up the stick because the ape has an opposable thumb. And in the liberal or modern understanding of human being, that's really crucial. Because we human beings are tool users and makers. We use implements and weapons and so he picks up the stick and he kills the panther, one of them, and then they have a fight with the tribe next door and they just kick the crap out of him because now they're waving these sticks around, hitting people with them. And then in the last stage, before it cuts away to something I'll tell you about, in the last stage, there's a whole flurry of animals getting whacked in the head and falling over dead. These apes are eating really well now. And that's not good for the other animals. It changes nature, and it changes the apes. Nature is change in the modern liberal understanding. In the last scene about the apes, one of the apes throws the stick way up in the air, and it goes up like that, and then the picture resolves. It's a very good movie, by the way. It's very well shot, although it's kind of hard to figure out, especially at the end, what the devil it means. But then the next thing you know, there's a modern woman, and she turns out to be a stewardess on a spaceship, and she's walking around in zero gravity, and she's beautiful. And she's not like the apes, she's erect. And she's surveying a guy whose ballpoint pen floats off in the air, right? So we've cut from the monolith, changing the ape, and it's using tools, to the next stage. And the next stage is us. And we look different, right? Our physical appearance has evolved significantly. We're still bipeds and we're still upright, and because we're upright, vision is still our chief sense. But you can just see they're thinking, once you start using these clubs, the next thing you know, you're going to the moon. It stops in the middle, and I'll interject this now because it's really good. It's a picture of modern government. They stop at some space station, and they change spaceships, I guess. And a bunch of international bureaucrats sit around and talk. And they talk just like bureaucrats talk. It's all very civil and polite. And they're asking each other questions, and nobody's giving anybody any information. And it's all very civil, and it's all very obscure. And then they get up to the moon, and come to find out, up on the moon, they've discovered another monolith up there. And I'll cut to the chase. The point is, apparently, these alien beings who make these monoliths, they planted one to get us started on the Earth, and they planted one up on the moon for us eventually to uncover. And when it gets uncovered, it sends a signal to Jupiter, where these beings apparently are located. And that tells us, we're here, and we've got this far. And now it's time for us to make contact. And if you just think about that story for a minute, it means that it's a story of evolution, of change. And they're going to meet a different kind of being. You don't ever really get to see that kind of being. It seems to have power, this other kind of being on Jupiter. It's in later books in this series. It's emerged that this other being is strong enough, using these monoliths, to create other moons and maybe planets. And it's also strong enough to age us and then reverse our age. Because one of the astronauts becomes a very old man, and then he becomes, in the last scene, a little baby floating up in the heavens somehow. So it's a story of change. And the story of change involves us using tools to effect the change and change ourselves and nature. And in addition, it's a story of science, which comes from the Latin word to know, but doesn't really mean knowing anymore. Now it means sophisticated use of tools to effect change. These tools are invented by what we call the scientific method, which is you just control everything, set a chain of events in motion, observe what happens, see if it confirms what you'd speculated at the beginning, and then do it over and over again. And that's the only way to learn. But if you learn, you can grow very great power. And of course, it is a fact that that works. And it is a fact that that is remaking the world all the time. This fake news stuff, right? What that used to be like 100 years ago was there used to be at least 2 newspapers in every town, and at least 2 of them would be affiliated with a political party and carry that in its title. So it was easy to figure out, which one you'd like the better. And also, it's easy to figure out how to read them both and make sure you get both arguments, right? But today, it's coming from everywhere at incredible rates all day. Did you know, I know, and you probably don't, that Speaker Ryan has announced he's not going to seek re-election this year. And that probably happened 15 minutes ago, and I found it out probably 2 minutes after that, right? Well, it just changes everything. If the pace and the quantity are so different. And I said at the beginning that this scholarship is actually how you sort this stuff out. But Lord, there's a lot to sort out now. And that means that you are required more than you used to be required to make priorities and figure out what's important and focus on understanding that. Because you can't understand everything anymore. Can't follow everything anymore. This new understanding of America, what's great about America? What America is, it's the greatest country in the world. Many American liberals think that. I mean, they also are very impatient with it too, because it's hidebound in certain ways. But right there in the beginning, the principle of change was the key principle. It was open to radical development. And it could become whatever it wanted to become. The argument for the living Constitution, by the way, I believe in the living Constitution. I believe it's still the law of the land. But the living Constitution meaning whatever the devil we want it to mean today, that is the explicit basis of that expression in many famous Supreme Court opinions, right? It just means what we see it to mean today given all of our conditions. Everything changes, see? And the greatness of America is that. Now, if you think about that one step more and think about that movie, the difference between the ape and that woman that you see next is a very big difference. And the implication is the next difference you see will be a very big difference too. And that means the ape and the woman have something in common. They're both way stations on a journey. They're changing. The process of change is sovereign. Our dignity, such as we have it, is that we can maybe get control of the process. But that means you could do just about anything to that woman, just like was done with that ape. That's one view of America and its greatness. The other view is different in kind. It's not different in degree, it's a different kind. It's a different principle. It's a different beginning point and way of thinking. Modern liberalism doesn't really start with nature. It starts with change and converts nature into change. The American Revolution and classical thought at this level of abstraction is the same. They start with nature. And what does nature mean? It's a very pregnant word. It's a great word. It means, it starts out meaning birth. It's a Latin word for birth. Or it means more generally the process of begetting and growth by which living things come to be. So plant an acorn, oak tree comes. Plant a pine nut cone, pine tree comes. And you know, two people get married, I mean, formerly of the different genders, then, you know, they're going to make human children if they make any children at all. And that's nature, right? And think about it, it's just so much is implied in that word. Because if it means begetting and growth, growth is a troublesome term. Because our children, you know, like Bridget this morning, she just was spectacular this morning, and I was very impressed. I expected to be, I have her in class right now, but more than I expected, right? Because she's grown up, right? And that means at that kind of thing she did this morning, Bridget is better at that than she would have been 5 years ago. And you know, then you think about this, not as good as she will be in 5 years. She's still growing. But you know, living things all end up the same way. Dead. And also declining. And so to define growth is a little bit complicated. Because how do you know when it stops growing and it starts decaying? You know, compare Bridget with me. And at least physically, she's on the way up. I'm not, right? Now, how do you know that? Because, you know, Bridget and I, by the way, are going to end up in exactly the same condition. Indeed, exactly the same condition as the oak tree. We're going to rot, you know. So, when does the growth stop and the decay begin? And the answer is, it's probable that I, at least, and all of you, in your essential human characteristics, are still growing. And the time is likely to come, if you live a very long time, when that will stop, when you become physically weak in ways that prevent you from growing. But if you can teach a class and argue with the young and come to this conference, we're still growing. But what that growing means is that in those respects, although not physically, we are becoming more fully like ourselves. We are becoming better human beings. What Mark Antony says of Brutus, not long before he killed him, he was the noblest Roman of them all. He was sanguine, and the elements were so mixed up in him that all nature could proclaim this was a man, right? Fully a man, having all the elements of the man. That requires being mature, and mature not just in body but in character. And in other words, he's calling Brutus a great man. You can't be a great man unless you're grown. You have to be big enough to be a man, fully a man. But that's not decisive. The decisive things are the development of all of the qualities that amount to excellence. And that's contained in that idea of that little seed and that growth. And then if you think beyond that, just one more step, you find out that there's lots and lots of things that have natures that grow. And each of those things is different. And so nature comes to mean Yosemite Valley, right? The arrangement of all of the living things. And then, because the whole cosmos moves in a pattern, nature means the whole order and way of nature. Think what a word that is. And if you put in the Declaration of Independence, the laws of nature and of nature's God, that's a whacking big statement, right? And think how they deploy those words. They are saying to the King of England, who is the most powerful human being on earth, and they don't even have an army. Well, they do have an army. It's a pitiful little thing. And they've appointed George Washington to head it. And he had never, and he turned out to be one of the greatest people who ever lived, but you couldn't tell that for sure at that time. What you did know is that neither he nor anybody else who was on the side of independence had ever moved a large army from one place to another. And that was one of George Washington's very early failings, right? That he, at the Battle of New York, right? He just couldn't get his army. He couldn't figure out very well where it should go. He got better at that, but having figured out where it should go, he didn't know how to get it there. And all these British generals, they just grew up on that stuff, right? And they just were just adept and tremendous and just overwhelmed him for most of the American Revolutionary War. So isn't it a crazy thing for them to write this thing to the king, upending all he understood to be his authority? And they needed something big to do that. And the big thing was the laws of nature and of nature's God. And they are grounded in this idea of the good that we have, right? Because they're saying to him in the Declaration of Independence, what does human equality mean? Right? It can't mean we're all the same size. It can't mean we're all the same smarts. It can't mean we're all the same sex. It can't mean we're all the same industry. Everybody knows that. Nobody's ever really been seriously confused about that. It means that we're all the same kind of thing. And that includes the king. And so when you, king, want to rule any other person, and it doesn't matter if your family is old and you ride in a golden carriage and the armies respond to you, what it means is you can't do anything to us without our permission. That's nature. And you see how differently that regards us, right? It means that cussed and stubborn and awful as we are, we may not be governed without our consent. However willful we may be in our animal nature to want things, it is wrong for us to take something that rightly belongs to another person. The idea of equality that's common to that other view is that since everything is changing, including us, and since we are going to use science and sophisticated tools to control that process, we can actually have a goal to make equality mean we all come out the same. But of course, that has to be engineered, which is the purpose of modern education, and also why schools are so boring. Because it's a stupid undertaking, and when you get in the middle of it, nobody likes it, especially young people who don't know any better. Old people can see it as a way to manipulate and engineer upon other persons, which is how the schools are organized today. It's the reason most of its employees don't teach. Most of its employees, it's hard to tell what most of them do, because it's very artful. You know, we have this wonderful, transparent, and accountable government. And I guess Frank Luntz is teaching me to use the word accountable now, not transparent. And yeah, transparent, that's an old word too. But they don't keep the data so that you can know, sorry, I have to shut that up, so that you can know what all the people do. They're just grouped into huge category other. And, you know, that's half the staff of the public schools, and it's very difficult to find out what they're actually doing, but you do know that a significant number of them are in the business of telling teachers what to do so they can tell students what to do. So this old idea of equality stops all this, and this old idea has two characteristics that I have to mention, and one of them is it's incredibly stubborn. You can watch the movie 2001 all you want to, but if they took out that woman, that handsome woman who was serving on the spaceship, and they did something cruel to her, everybody would think that was wrong. Or in our Constitution reader, because we try to teach people to be scholars, which is careful thinkers, we produced the Alabama Slave Code. It's a really great document to read, right? And what it does is it's rules about the slaves and about all the free white males have to ride posse once a month looking for runaways. Because as we know from the doctrines of the Confederacy, slavery was very popular among the slaves, except for this embarrassing fact that they kept trying to get away. And, but the rules are like this. Slave can't be off the plantation without written permission for more than 3 hours, I think it is. You can't have a slave in a dwelling not on the plantation without written permission for more than 30 minutes. Slaves can't gather in groups larger of 3 for more than 30 minutes without the master or his representative present, right? Just think what kind of life that is, living under rules like that, right? You can't, like, 4 of you show up, well, you got to look around and see if you've been there too long. But then in that Alabama slave code, and I'm telling you, it's just an organized system for treating people like animals. There's an exemption to these gathering rules. And that's an exemption when the slaves are meeting with the preacher. Isn't that interesting? Now, there are laws in countryside in America today, and were then, about how you have to fence your animals in, or else they'll get out and eat somebody else's stuff, or get in the way of the road, right? Those laws about those animals don't include any exemptions about unless the animals happen to be going to church. Or as Lincoln said famously one time, Douglas says, if he can take his hog and his buckboard into Nebraska and the federal government protect his property in it, why can't he take his slave? And Lincoln said, good question. If there's a difference between the hog and the slave, but down south they don't pass laws making it illegal to teach hogs to read. We see things, and we have this gift. We recognize what they are. And it's very stubborn. It's hard to drive it away. In the Wannsee Conference, where the Nazis had a big conference and planned the final solution, factories to put people on cattle cars and take them by railroad to a factory to kill them en masse, and they did kill several million that way. They took careful notes, and they let everybody take up one set of notes to study for a month with a promise to destroy them, and they kept records of everybody who got them, made them sign a book. But why destroy the notes, right? They were embarrassed. These are not, in fact, cattle. These are people. Stubborn, right? And the second thing about America in its original meaning, because this liberal understanding of the beginning of America, that what's distinctive about it is that it's open, is of course an obvious and willful misreading of the American Revolution. Partly the misreading was done out of charity. They wanted to admire it. But they had to take out that part about, you can never rule me except by my consent. That's a fixity, right? And then because we're animals too, we're going to require to have rules. But the people who live under those rules, they're animals just like us. They can't have absolute power. They are constrained first by consent, but also by representation and separation of powers and all that stuff. And that, to say Woodrow Wilson, for example, that just gets in the way of the scientific enterprise. That's written like the world was still understood in terms of Newton. He writes this explicitly. You know, as far as I know, I see Ed Earler back there. He probably know better than I do. But I don't know that Newton ever comes up. But now we have Darwin, he says. Everything changes, see. So the old way is stubborn, but also the old way pushes tremendous energy. Right? Why do you work? You got to eat. Do you work better when you get to build something and keep it? You see, the energy and hope that comes from the principle of equality and the understanding of nature that are the correct ones, and the undeniable one by the witness of our own eyes, they have remade the world. They have actually the thing that did that. And if you just study the story of America, it is unique. It is obviously one of the greatest and best things that ever happened, because it starts from nothing. Settled along the seaboard, getting these big pretensions about being governed by their consent. And we've settled the continent and spread free and representative government across the continent, step by step, and without any interruption. And we have the stain of slavery. Every human society, we have other stains too, plenty of them, but every human society has stains. Those stains they trouble us, because in our Constitution reader, John Jay writes a great letter to the head of the English Manumission that freed the slave society. And he says, you know what's going on over here? He says, there's always been slavery around. And nobody thought about it very much. You know, North and South it was too. But he said, under the influence of this thing we have done, we are waking up. And we are starting to get rid of that. And I expect that process to go on. I'll tell you what interrupted it, by the way, is the first American version of this progressive history. The first American version of the progressive history was in the Confederacy, and it was on the right. The modern ones are on the left. You see? But just think how it liberates. You know why our college is so good? I mean, it is really good. Come and see it. But I'll tell you why it's so good. You know, I'd like to tell you it's my personal brilliance. Come to find out, and it is, no. But come to find out, it's because we all do it, right? Every day, everybody's working on it. You know, many of us have bad days pretty often, right? But everybody is after the same thing because we agreed to be. And you know, you want to get into Hillsdale College, go make a perfect score on the SAT, and then come and sit in the admissions office and tell them that you're not sure you want to come. See if you get in, right? Whereas somebody who makes 80th percentile, and I think our numbers run in the mid-90s now, and they just come in and they just say, you're good. A woman said this to me with Jeff Lantis, who's here, the former admissions director now. He does athletic stuff. He's an old jock. This girl said to me, I'd known her since she was little, and she didn't have a very good academic record. And she said, you, look, in my office, demanded to get in my office. And she said, you are going to let me in here. And I did, you know. So do you see, we have a fight between two things that are incompatible, and they regard us in an entirely different light, right? And the indignity of the intellectual classes in America at the rudeness of the Midwest and the South and the rural areas, their displeasure at the current president of the United States because of his rudeness and clumsiness and unwillingness to play the game, right? And, you know, he does seem to be looser with women than a fellow ought to be, you know. And I don't like that, right? But you kind of got to admire his enemies, for his enemies, right? and he doesn't seem to be afraid of them. And the point is, I think their indignation is real and heartfelt because they believe in this vision that we can remake everything, right? And to thwart that is to thwart the highest duty. Whereas people like me and you probably, what I think is the most beautiful thing that ever happened in politics is the American Declaration of Independence and the career of the people who wrote them and the fact that it produces people like us. And what are we except ordinary people who get a chance to live a great and fully human life? That means this is a conflict of principle. And it means it's not going to go away. And it has to be decided one way or t'other. And I'll just say one thing about conservatism, because I guess I was supposed to talk about that, but I don't know. Conservatism at its best means the love of that strain that produced the United States of America, which reaches, by the way, back through the great books and the great civilizations. It's divided, conservatism. It's got more than one strain of thought in it. Practical situations like the current political situation tend to divide the conservatives. But just think about conservatism. If you have a conservative disposition, it means you kind of like to preserve things. But you know, the past is like the present. There's a lot ugly back there. You know what they say is the oldest profession, right? I don't actually think that's true. I think the oldest profession is farming. But, but that other profession has a certain notoriety, right? And you wouldn't want to conserve that. Well, some people would, I guess. But so we're living here. It's not just true that the greatness of America is at stake. There are alternative views of what that greatness constitutes. And they can't both be right. One of them has got to derive from the real goodness of America, its actual identity, and only that one could be great. And so I would suggest that we organize our lives to try to perpetuate that. Thank you.
Take a few questions, Larry? Yeah. Okay, we have time for questions. Again, please wait for the microphone. They may be moving a little slowly because we're, as I said, a little cozy in here, but be patient and the microphone will be brought to you. So questions, please.
Jeff Myers from Summit Ministries. Can you expand a little bit on the comment you made about progressive action in the 1800s interrupting the movement against slavery? Can you expand on that?
So you know who John C. Calhoun was? And you can't understand Lincoln. That's like Miss Atkinson's point, right? You can't understand Lincoln if you don't read Stephen Douglas and John Calhoun, right? And John Calhoun's a little tedious, but he graduated from Yale University, and he was a student of Friedrich Hegel. He fancied himself an Aristotelian, but I have arguments why I don't think that works. And he's the one, most prominently and early, declared slavery a good thing. And why was it good? Because they're in a different condition than we are. Their humanity is not the decisive thing if they've got it. They're a different kind of thing, and it would be an abomination to live with them as equal citizens. And because we are superior to them, we all become aristocrats. And then there can be harmony in the society, you see. And that is many other people, not so much Calhoun, but say Alexander Stephens, the vice president of the Confederacy. They ascribe these differences to evolution, a development, a change, right? Calhoun is a kind of scientific utopian. He wrote this book called The Disquisition on Government, and it's, I'm so proud of myself about this, in the college. I once messed up my syllabus, and you know, we read the great documents from American history in our introductory politics course on the Constitution of the United States. We start with Aristotle, and we read through, you know. And that means you're reading a lot of the great documents. Well, the whole book is 800 pages long, I think. And the Disquisition on Government is about that long. And I messed up my syllabus, and I assigned the reading of it all. And they did. and I was, at first I was horrified. And I told them, and they were horrified. And I said, well done. Good job. But there's a line in it. It would be, this is an exact quote, I think. It would be impious, let's say, failure of respect toward God, to believe that God would give us the powers of natural science and permit us to use them for evil. So you see, whatever exercise of human power there is, that's okay. That's the exercise is what makes it right. And that means, using an atomic bomb on the village in northern England where my wife grew up, that would be, I guess that would be okay. So that's the point. And that comes in through German historicism. And, human civilization is an old story, and there are many controversies amidst them. And if you read that story and try to learn about it, first of all, it's a lifelong task and you'll never get it done. But a second thing is, it makes your opinions more moderate. Because, what's good about America? Well, one huge thing about it is we leave each other the devil alone, right? And we should do that, I don't like the way all kinds of people live in America. And I would rather not have to do with them. And if I try to dictate how they live, I'll end up having to do with them, and that'd be bad. And I also don't want them trying to dictate to me. That's a kind of moderate solution to the problem of politics. And when we get these utopian things, politics become extreme. Like controlling everything that's said in the news. What Ms. Atkinson just described is an attempt to control what people say. Do you know why Winston Churchill knew Hitler was weak and could be beaten? He thought he might not be beaten, but in principle he could be beaten. He says, what are they afraid of? Words. They cower, right? Churchill was really good with words. That's why he was able to beat them.
Dr. Arnn, I have a big belief that God was involved in the creation of two countries in this world. First one was Israel, where he gave Israel to the Jews, his chosen people. And the second one was bringing together some of the greatest minds gathered in one room to create America. I'd like your thoughts on that.
Yeah, I think God was heavily involved in both those things and a bunch of other stuff too. I think he's a very meddlesome God, but I think he blessed those two things in particular. But think of the burst of philosophy in Athens, and that was a great thing. Think of Elizabethan England, Shakespeare, right? Elizabeth I, the advance of limited government that was made possible by this little country that just by accident had two features. it was cut off by sea from everybody else, and therefore and then that gave rise to the second feature. Because it didn't need a big land army, the king was weaker, and so the House of Commons kept winning arguments with the king over 400 years and cutting off his head sometimes. And then the second thing was they got really good at the sea, because they're all surrounded by the sea, and the seas there are very stormy, to use the topical phrase today. And so they were great sailors, right? And that meant once you get out on the sea, you can go anywhere. And so that spread all over the place. See, so I see the hand of Providence in more things than just those two, but surely those two.
We have time for one more question.
Jeremy Mollison from Denver. I recently saw the movie The Darkest Hour, which I understand you helped to consult on. And I was hoping I could hear you talk a little bit about the movie itself. I've heard a lot of good feedback of the movie, but I specifically heard some people criticize it because they say that it portrayed Churchill as being too weak. And I was hoping you could speak to that specifically in your remarks.
Yeah. You seen the movie? No. Well, I love the movie, and a weird feature of my life is that I've known Gary Oldman for a few years, and I've known his producer and manager of his career for 30 years, and I like them both a lot. And they set out to make a very great movie. It's one of the greatest dramatic demonstrations of the importance of human choice ever put together. And the reason is that event that it depicts. See, what was Hitler's claim? Hitler's claim was just like John Calhoun's claim, just like Joe Stalin's claim. History is on our side, and it's irresistible. And we're going to found the 1,000-year Reich, right? You know, it lasted 12 years. But, you know, he's optimistic, he was. But he thought it was irresistible. And, you know, he nearly won. And the reason England didn't get out of the war is because on the 28th of May, 1940, Winston Churchill walked in a room and gave one of the greatest speeches anybody ever gave. Hard to think anybody else could have given that speech. It's known that there wasn't anybody else in the room who wanted to. And he talked him out of it, and that's what that film is about. Now, it's a fact that the screenwriter, whom I met, good guy, you know, bright young man. I'm old now, so I think of everybody that way. He had the theory that on the 27th of May, when this cabinet crisis going on about whether to accept an offer of peace mediation from Mussolini, not the nicest guy in Europe, that Churchill himself weakened and wanted to quit. And he's published a book called Darkest Hour, in which that claim is apparently made, although I haven't read the book. And he asked me about it. And he said, do you think Churchill had this moment in May the 27th when he wanted to quit? And I said, no. And he said, why not? I said, well, you know, I don't know of any, hard to prove a negative, right? But I don't know of any evidence for it. And I know a lot of evidence that he didn't. What evidence? And I said, well, Churchill wrote stuff down, huge amounts. And people around him wrote stuff down. Well, he claims to see in the Diary of Lord Halifax some basis for that. And so there's a Churchill who's weary and tired, but that point never gets made. And that's because there were a lot of good people around that movie not wanting that point made, because it just didn't seem to be true. And but it doesn't bother me too much that even that on that day that I don't like it that they showed Churchill drinking all the time, because he did drink all the time, but he was never drunk. And it was a point of pride with him. He drank. He first drank in his life when he was a soldier in India. And what they would do in India, and I don't even know if it's fake news or junk science, but when they drank water, they would pour a little bit of whiskey in it to think maybe it would kill the organisms living in it, right? And so he developed a taste for that, very weak. And he drank that all day. And he did, you know, starting about 10 o'clock in the morning. If you made him a strong drink, he would pour it in the fireplace. And now he did drink a fair amount of champagne and wine with lunch and dinner, but I always say, you know, he was in politics for 55 years, including the two greatest wars in history and the Great Depression. And whilst he did all that, he wrote 50 wonderful books and about 9,000 closely printed large pages of speeches, all himself. If he was drunk, I'm going to take up the practice. Oh, and if you think about that, what was it like on the 27th of May, 28th of May? Mussolini's offering peace. The French are getting ready to surrender. The French army is broken up, didn't fight very well. The British army is running to the sea. It was just nature asserting itself. The two armies were joined, you know, up in northeastern France, in Belgium, and both sides of the Belgian border. And the Germans came around behind in 1914 in the famous Schlieffen Plan. They'd swept to the right. Well, they didn't do it that time. They went through the Ardennes forest and mountain tracks and got tanks through it. Nobody thought they could do it. And so these two armies are here, and their communication between them and Paris, their communications are disarranged and cut off, and everything is chaos. And the two armies start moving. And you know, the people in command only half know where they are. And the French, just by automatic inclination, start moving toward Paris, and the British start moving to the sea. They're a marine people, see. And they get to Dunkirk Beach, and all that's going on. And the British Army is like 20 divisions, something like that, maybe 8 divisions, I can't remember. And the German army is several hundred. And they're going to be alone. What are they to do? And then these people in the cabinet with Churchill are more popular than Churchill. He hadn't become the greatest man in the world yet. Or I argue he already had, just nobody knew it yet. But, you know, after these days in 1940, after the year 1940, for the rest of his life, everybody he met treated him like he was the greatest man in the world, even though they might hate him and resist him. But they did it that way now because, wow, you know. And so, if, you know, it stands to reason he'd be down. And he did write that he would, you know, they have this scene in the subway where these British people, and he didn't go down in the subway and have that, but I love that scene. And I love it in part because Churchill says that he would, he writes in the Second World War, his memoir of the Second World War, he writes that I would drive along and see people on the street and in the bus queues, and I would see the resolution on their faces, and I would see the cheer on their faces if they would sight me. He said, the island was suffused in a white glow. The British were the lion, and I was called upon to give the roar. Isn't that great, you know? I mean, that's it. And so they show those people on the subway giving him words to say. You know, one boy says, never, right? And then the West Indian British subject, right? Marcus might have been his name. I think it was, and that's a Roman name, right? And so Churchill cites this thing that he memorized when he was a little boy. You want to hear about Winston Churchill? Because Winston Churchill is very great. When he was a little boy, he was a poor student and a great student in alteration, depending on what he wanted. And so one day they have a recitation contest, and he's reciting at Harrow School Macaulay's Lays of Ancient Rome. And he starts reciting, and he just keeps going. And everybody starts stirring around looking, and then one of the dons gets up and goes over to the shelf and gets the book off and finds the page, and Churchill's still going. And then people look at him, and the guy looks up, and he's following it down, and he goes, you know, right? Tremendous memory. And so one of his very favorite things, outstepped brave Horatius, the captain of the gate. In every life, to every man born on this earth, death cometh soon or late. But how can men die better than facing fearful odds for the ashes of his father and the temple of his gods? And they have Marcus reciting that with Churchill in the background, and that is specifically Churchill's point. Churchill believed in freedom and representative government, among other reasons because he thought that was braver than these despotisms. And that hard virtue, we get a chance to exercise because we are responsible for this thing. And that means, by the way, what Churchill will teach you, if you think that these odds are overwhelming and they cannot be faced, you should get up in the morning and think, that is the situation for which I was made.